This third unit will give you an overview of three important ideologies, three important way of thinking that have influenced the history writing in Europe. The first is positivism, next is Marxism, and the third is Annals School of Historiography. So when you say use the phrase like school of historiography, that means it is a particular way of looking at history. So positivism is also a particular way of looking at history. So in today's lesson, we'll be studying about what is the meaning of positivism, in what circumstances the idea of positivism has born, because the ideas are born into the particular circumstances. Who were the important positivist thinker, and then there is an important positivist historian called Leopold Ranke. What was the contribution of Leopold Ranke, as well as the contribution of the positivist thinker, and what are the shortcomings in the positivist way of looking at history? We will be discussing all that. Just a minute. Well, okay, Annie, I hope I'm audible again.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes,
Well,
sir.
okay. So what does the positivism is, the idea of positivism is that only that knowledge is a knowledge which is very definite, which doesn't have any ambiguity, which is certain, which is beyond doubt, and that can be verified by the empirical evidences. Empirical evidences means evidences that is obvious, that is seen. For example, if I feel good or bad about one particular person, then that is not a knowledge. That is my perception about that person. My analysis of that person should be based entirely on my observation of his behavior. So this kind of ideas is called positivism idea, and it says that in a knowledge, in a history, or in any other subject other than literature, what should you write as a knowledge should have an empiricist basis. That is, it should be verified, it should be verifiable, and it should be reliable, it should be beyond doubt. And this kind of idea, the reason behind the emergence of this kind of idea was reaction against romanticism. Ideas even in the next topic about Marxism, we'll be studying a little bit about Hegel as well. And Hegel says that in the human society, the growth of knowledge always grow through the cycle of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and again thesis. What does that mean is that any idea becomes a very prevailing idea in the society, but the people will emerge who will challenge that ideas, and there will be clash of these two ideas, resulting into the synthesis of the ideas. Now what came as a result of that synthesis will become an established ideas, that now become thesis. And after a few years, again some people will challenge that idea, so they will give an antithesis. So again there will be clash of these two ideas, thesis and antithesis, and finally again there will be synthesis. So this is an eternal unending process through which human try to understand the world around them, try to understand the universe, try to acquire more and more knowledge. So this process is a continuous process. So in Europe, what happened is, in the 14th 15th century there was an era of enlightenment, and in the era of enlightenment, what we have seen is that people started thinking rationally and scientifically about the human life. Human life became very important. And if everything is to be studied from scientific and rational point of view, there was a reaction which is called romanticism. They tried to romanticize the human life, and this romantic idea became prevailing. We have romantic poetry, we have romantic way of writing, romantic historical novels like the novels of Walter Scott. And as I said earlier, any ideas come with the relevance as well as with the expiry date. The idea seems to be challenged later on. So this idea of romanticism, or the prevalence of the romanticism, was begin to be challenged by the people, and they said this romanticism in the knowledge creation, let it be in the history writing, let it be in the economics, is not acceptable. We should try to verify what the knowledge is, and it's out of that reaction that the positivism has emerged. So the reason behind the emergence of the positivism is that there were a lot of lacunas in the knowledge creation, and it'll take the case of history writing. In case of history writing, a lot of history was written based on the secondary sources. People did not try to go to the primary sources, try to verify. A lot of archives and the old record were not available to the people. And to overcome this shortcoming, the idea of positivism have emerged, which emphasized that, which insisted that the knowledge should be certain, it should be based on the evidence, it should be based on the facts, and they do believe that as the laws of science can be verified in all the circumstances in the laboratory, similarly, by studying and observing the past, by studying the humanities, we can draw certain laws which are as good as scientific laws, and that is the reason they started calling history as a social physics. For example, the law of physics says that if you heat the metal, it will expand. If you boil the water, it will turn into steam. If you go on cooling the water, it will turn into ice. So these are the scientific laws which human beings have derived after observation, and they have scientific basis, they have empirical evidences, and they can be verified. Similarly, by studying human life, by studying the past, you can also derive certain kind of scientific laws. That is what the positivism tries to say. And as I told, there were a number of shortcomings in the history writing, and G.P. Gooch, in his book History and Historian of 19th Century, he pointed out certain shortcomings. Like, he says that there is a belief in the divine, that human life is controlled by the divine. There is a scarcity of sources, archives are not available, open. There is an absence of critical attitude. People do not are not very critically investigating the issues. Then there is no training of scientific study and writing of history. And because of all this reason, there was a lacuna, there was shortcoming in the history writing. The mysticism was quite prevalent, and because of all these, the truth was not being stated very clearly or very reliably. Mm. There was no systematic training to the historian, and that is the reason people like Barthol Nibur and Ranke, they tried to give shape and make history as a profession. And one of the, we'll talk, so you understand the background. There was a lot of romanticism. History was not based on the very scientific investigation of the sources. People wrote whatever they heard about, and these shortcomings were pointed out by the people, and that is how the positivism have emerged. They tried to remove this shortcoming from the history writing. So who were this positivist thinker? One important person in Germany was Barthold Niebuhr. It was Prussia at that time. And Barthold Niebuhr in 1810, he gave speeches in Berlin University. And in his speeches, do you remember that when we studied about the Roman historian, we have studied about the Roman historian called Livy. And this Livy, he wrote History of Rome. And Barthol Niebuhr, by studying this history of Rome, had derived his conclusion that Livy has not made scientific investigation of the resources available to him. He has written just whatever he heard or whatever he thought. So he pointed out a lot of defects in the writing of Levy's book. And that is considered as the early pioneer of the positivist way of thinking, where you try to investigate everything that is written. And then later on, his book was published, which is also titled as History of Rome 1811-12. And then what Barthol Niebuhr has done in Germany, Auguste Comte has done in France. Auguste Comte was a very important positivist. He was a mathematician but became philosopher later on, and he was the person who first time used the phrase called positivist philosophy of history. And in the elaboration of this philosophy, he says that a historian should write only that thing that can be verified. And he also believed that as by observation we derive certain laws in science. So by observing human life and human history, you can derive certain laws about the human history. This is a bit complicated, Annie, but you just remember that one of the we will be repeating this in Marxism and annals also. But to begin with, you just remember that by positivists believed that by studying human life, you can derive certain laws which they call determined laws. For example, In case of physics, the determined law is you hit the metal, it will expand. There is no change. It will happen. You do it in India, you do it in America. That's bound to happen. Similarly, in case of human being also, there are certain determined laws. You put human being into the particular situation, and he will behave in a particular manner. That is what this positivists believe, which is I'm putting it in a very straightforward word. But you just remember this phrase determined laws, which says that if the human being is put in the particular situation, he or she will behave in a particular way. So Auguste Comte has written this book, The Course of Positivist Philosophy, System of Positivist Politics, and this book explain the positivist philosophy, and there are sort of some more elaboration of his thought which is not really required. I just want you to remember these two authors. We will be discussing Ranke a little bit in detail. uh, he is also a person who had applied scientific method to the study of society, and he uses the phrase called science of sociology. He also says that your imagination should be subordinate to the observation. You should believe on the observation, not on imagination. Like the first example I gave. For example, I may just say that Anna is not a good student, but that is my imagination, and it has no scientific basis. My perception of your personality should be based on evidences. Whether you are doing your assignments right, whether you are attentive in the class, this is called observation. So my judging of your personality should be based on my observation, not on my imagination. That is what the positivist is trying to do. Then another important positivist thinker is Thomas Bacall, and he wrote History of Civilization of England. That I'm just telling you the name of the few of the thinkers who wrote their text based on the positivist trend. That is scientific investigation of the resources, giving proper footnote, giving proper references, giving proper bibliography, which is generally accepted now. Now everybody, whenever they go for research, they do give footnote, they do give bibliography. So this Thomas Bacall, he also made a critical analysis of the sources that were available to him. He used statistical method for the study of social sciences. Well, and then there was Edward Gibbon, who wrote a book called Decline and Fall of Roman Empire, which is also written through the perspective of the positivists. And now let us come to the Leopold Ranke. He was German, Prussian, and 1795 to 1886 was his period. He was inspired by Niebuhr's History of Rome, and he gave that positivist thought a push. He wrote a lot of text based on the positivist thought, and then apart from that, he also trained number of people. So we'll come to that. His seminars are very famous. Ranke, in the early phase of his life, he studied Greek and Roman literature. He studied religious scripture. He was fascinated by the novels of Walter Scott. Though he liked the novel, but he was quite uncomfortable by the way the historical facts were distorted while writing novel. There was a lot of space for imagination in the novel. There is a lot of space for the imagination in the novel, and historical facts are twisted. So he did not like it, and he thought, why not to make a scientific history? And he became teacher of history at a young age. Later on, he became professor in Berlin University. This I told you. And while trying to understand the scientific history, apart from literature, trying to decipher or trying to separate it from literature and imagination, he find that the real life, that is the real history, is much more fascinating than literature. So he wrote that book called History of Latin and Teutonic People, and the preface of this text is very important, where he elaborates his idea about what history should be. And there is a lot of work done by him. He wrote History of Latin and Teutonic People, which I told you. Then he wrote History of Pope, then German history at the time of Reformation. Then he wrote 9 books on Prussian history. He also wrote History of France, the origin of the War of Revolution, where he talks about French Revolution. So all these books are written with the positivist perspective, where the resources are properly listed out, where he gave proper references, and he made a scientific analysis of all those resources available to him. Then his another very significant contribution is History of the Word, which he started writing very late at the age of 83. In 1880, first two volumes were published, which deals with Greece and early Rome. Then third volume was published, which deals with Roman Empire. Then fourth on Christianity. Fifth on migration of German people to European countries in ancient time. Sixth, it talks about the Roman Emperor Otto first. And seventh volume, when he was writing, he died. Now, apart from this book, which were a kind of pioneering book written from the perspective of the positivists, or by using the positivist research methodology of properly giving the references, properly scrutinizing the resources, properly engaging with the external and internal criticism, which we have already studied, Ranke's seminars are very famous. So, there was, as I told you earlier, one of the shortcoming in the history writing in the 18th century was that lack of proper professional training to the historian. And Ranke have started this proper training of the historian. He started having the seminar first in his room, then in the university, and these seminars became very famous from 1824 to 1871. People all across the Europe, the researcher, the student, they started going to Berlin to attend Ranke's seminar. And after going through that seminar, they will come back to their universities with these positivist ideas. And under the influence of Ranke, positivism spread all across Europe. The history, which was not an independent department in most of the universities, begin to be established now. Now history has developed a scientific temperament, and people accepted that history is an independent branch of studies. Earlier, it could be philosopher, or it could be literary person who used to write history, and there used to be a lot of imagination, a lot of mixing up. But now, under the influence of Ranke and positivism, history writing has become scientific in most of the European universities. So people of Europe, America, they came, they attended the seminar, and then the idea of positivism has spread to Japan also. And from Ranke's this seminar, his introduction to the different book, we can understand his ideas of history. And he says that the history should be understood in its own term. Our mind is influenced by today's thought, and we should not impose today's thought on the past. Past event, it takes place into the in particular context. So history, the past, it should be understood on its own term, and that is what is called, that is what he called as historicity. Then he was an empiricist. Empiricist, I have already referred to the word. Empirical research means the research that is based on the evidences. So he was definitely, all the positivists will be an empiricist. So he was an empiricist who said that the historical knowledge should be based on the facts that can be verified. Now, there is one very interesting thing about Ranke. As Ranke believed in positivism, and positivism believed in the scientific history writing, so in the scientific way of thinking, it's very difficult to believe on God, because God is something which you cannot show it to the people. But somehow Ranke tried to synthesize this positivist idea with with the existence of God. And he says that the way history is unfolding scientifically, it is happening because of the will of the God. So that is a bit, paradox in the writing of Ranke, that we see. He also stated that the sources could be less or more important. There are certain sources which are more important. There are certain sources which are less important. He emphasizes on the critical analysis of the sources. You must give references, footnote, bibliography, and without that, your history writing will not become reliable. Another important contribution of Ranke and positivists is that they tried to bring objectivity in history writing. They said that a historian should rise above his identity as a person belonging to the particular nation, particular race, particular gender, and try to write history from the objective perspective. And Ranke said ki the job of a historian is not to pass value judgment. He should not say that this person was bad or this person was good. He just write whatever he has observed. But as they insisted more on the written sources, under the influence of the positivism, the kind of history that began to be written in Europe was mostly a political history, because it's generally about the political history that we find a lot of resources. He believed that there are people, personality which influences history. We can draw the general law. This is over. Ranke is, because of his work, because of his contribution of giving a scientific basis to history writing, he is called father of modern historiography. History can be studied at social physics. That is what he says. Well, now because of this positivism, Ranke's idea and spirit of positivism, there was an unprecedented increase in the historical knowledge. A lot of history began to be written scientifically. A lot of sources. People now understood the importance of sources. So all over Europe, the archive were established. People started preserving resources, collecting resources, and cataloging them and making it available to the researchers. Subjectivity has reduced. Now you must write objective history. You understand subjectivity and objectivity? Subjectivity is your personal opinion, and objectivity is that is based on your observations. uh, General laws are begin to be formed. A lot of primary sources were published. Historical journal have started. Well, this I have already told. Rankin method became widespread in Europe. He says the history writing is not to please anybody. You just state what you observe. Original documents, people begin to search for it. But there are certain shortcomings. For example, the positivist attitude that history can be studied as a social physics is a bit problematic, because human nature is different than the material. A metal may expand every time you heat it, but if you put a human being in the same situation time and again, not necessary that he will react in the similar fashion every time. It's quite possible that he may react differently. So you just can't be a kind of objective observer. Secondly, objectivity is very difficult, because when I write history or when you write history, definitely your mind is going to be influenced by the thought that you are exposed to since beginning. The way your personality is shaped, that is going to influence the way you interpret history. Secondly, his historism is also a bit problematic. He says that history is to be understood in the context of its past. That is fine, that is one of the dimension, but then we always interpret history from the perspective of today. So our today's perspective is bound to influence our the way we interpret history. That is the reason the history written by you and history written by me, even though we both use the same sources, is bound to be different. Well, again, there is a problem about the value judgment. Like Ranke and positivists say that historians should not pass any value judgment. He should not say about historical character that this character was good or this character was bad. This is a bit problematic, because if you don't criticize the very obviously uh, devilish or inhuman practices like killing of Jews done by Hitler, then probably you are not imparting a right message to the people, to the generation who will read your history. So sometimes value judgment, though we can be as objective as humanly possible, but 100% objectivity is not possible. Similarly, we are bound to pass certain judgment. If we feel that somebody has some historical character has done something which is which will hurt the moral sense of the humanity in general, you can be critical of it. Underlining, drawing certain conclusion is difficult. That is over. So lastly, we will sum up. So positivism is an idea that has influenced the history writing, which believe that the historical facts, historical statement should be based on the evidences. Before you write history, the fact should be verified. By studying history, you can draw certain determined laws, and history can be studied as a science. So that is what the positivism is. I told you about the different important positivist thinker, Niebuhr, and then Kant, then Thomas Bacall. Just a minute. What was his name? French. Edward Gibbon, Thomas Bacall, and then Auguste Comte, and then Ranke's book. Ranke has written different book, and Ranke's seminar were also very famous. Though under the positivism, history writing has become very scientific now, as we generally most of the time do scientific history, and the way we do history, it owns a lot to the positivist way of thinking. But nevertheless, they did have certain shortcoming, because under the influence of positivism, it is mostly the political history which was written, and a lot of things like oral history, tribal history has begun to be, remain outside the preview of this. So here we end about the positivism. If you have any doubt, you can ask.